To begin our journey into the shadowed corridors of history and the silent spaces between the ink of the modern canon, we must first recognize that the world we inhabit is often defined as much by what is missing as by what is present. The concept of the 45 verses removed from the biblical record to keep humanity tethered to a specific, limited version of the human experience is not merely a conspiracy of paper and ink, but a profound metaphor for the cosmic censorship that governs our perception of reality. Imagine, if you will, a vast and ancient tapestry, woven with threads of gold that reflect the light of 1,000 suns, intended to map the very architecture of the soul and its place within the infinite expanse of the divine. Now, imagine that a frantic hand, guided by the tremors of fear and the hunger for earthly governance, reached out and plucked 45 specific strands from the weave. On the surface, the tapestry still appears functional. It covers the wall, it depicts a story, and it offers warmth to those who huddle beneath it. Yet, for the seeker whose eyes are tuned to the subtle geometry of the universe, the image is forever distorted. There are gaps where there should be bridges, and silences where there should be the roaring music of the spheres. This exploration is an attempt to peer into those gaps, to listen to those silences, and to understand why the powers of the world might find it necessary to prune the vine of spiritual knowledge, so that its fruit remains within the reach of the mundane. We stand at a precipice where the practicalities of religious history meet the swirling mists of the esoteric, a place where the literal and the symbolic dance in a perpetual eclipse. To speak of removed verses is to speak of the gatekeepers of the mind, those who, throughout the centuries, have sought to define the boundaries of the human spirit. If the soul is a boundless ocean, these removals represent the construction of a shore, a necessary boundary for some, perhaps, but a prison for those who were born to swim in the deep. The narrative of the human that has been handed down to us is often one of inherent limitation, of a creature defined by its fallibility, its physical needs, and its subservience to a distant, often inscrutable authority. But what if the missing fragments contain the blueprints for a different kind of humanity? What if the verses that were cast into the fire or hidden in the dust of desert caves spoke of a being that was not merely a servant of the divine, but a vessel for it? The removal of these words suggests an intentional narrowing of the aperture through which we view our own potential. It is as if we have been given a map of a small island and told it is the entire world, while the charts that show the continents beyond have been locked away in a vault to which we have forgotten we possess the key. In this introductory movement, we must contemplate the nature of the human as a social and theological construct. To be human, in the eyes of the keepers of the canon, is often to be manageable. It is to be a being that can be categorized, moralized, and directed toward the maintenance of an earthly order. The verses that were excised were likely those that vibrated with too much frequency, those that threatened to shatter the glass ceiling of the conventional psyche. They were the radical declarations of unity, the reminders of an internal light that requires no external lamp, and the descriptions of a sovereignty that transcends the laws of kings and clerics. By removing these anchors of transcendence, the architects of the modern Bible effectively anchored the human soul to the gravity of the earth. We are left with a spirituality that is often transactional, a series of pleas and promises made to a God who exists out there, rather than an awakening to the God who is the very fabric of in here. This cosmic dimension of the topic invites us to look past the historical debates over the Council of Nicaea or the politics of King James and see the broader, more ancient pattern at play: the eternal struggle between the expansion of consciousness and the desire for institutional control. As we move deeper into this exploration, we must approach the text not as a dead artifact, but as a living, breathing organism that has been wounded. To study the removed verses is to practice a form of spiritual archaeology, brushing away the layers of dogma to find the pulsating heart of a lost wisdom. We must ask ourselves why a verse that speaks of the soul's pre-existence might be seen as a threat to the stability of the church, or why a passage suggesting that the kingdom of heaven is an internal state of being rather than a future destination would be considered dangerous. The answer lies in the potency of the word. A word is more than a sound or a mark on a page. It is a frequency that can reorganize the structure of reality. If the human race were to truly internalize the idea that they are made of the same substance as the stars and the Creator, the structures of control that rely on fear, scarcity, and external validation would crumble like salt in the rain. The removal of these verses was not just an editorial choice. It was a cosmic intervention, an attempt to dampen the signal of the divine so that the static of the material world could remain the dominant broadcast. This journey is also one of personal reclamation. Each of us carries within us the echo of those missing verses, a phantom limb of the spirit that still feels the warmth of the light they once described. We feel it in our moments of unexplainable longing, in the sense that there is more to our existence than the cycle of birth, labor, and death. We feel it when we look at the night sky and sense a kinship with the infinite that our Sunday school lessons never quite managed to explain. By investigating the removed portions of our collective spiritual inheritance, we are essentially trying to remember ourselves. We are looking for the mirror that hasn't been cracked, the mirror that reflects not just our faces, but our essence. The narrative of being kept human is a narrative of being kept small, and the quest to find these lost words is the quest to reclaim our cosmic stature. It is a journey that requires us to be brave, for to look at what was removed is to realize that much of what we have been told is a half-truth, a beautiful but incomplete shadow of a much grander reality. As the sun of our understanding begins to rise over this landscape, we see that the 45 verses are not just a list of sentences, but a symbol for the entire hidden history of the human soul. They represent the gnosis, the direct, experiential knowledge of the divine, that has been systematically suppressed in favor of pistis, blind faith in an established authority. This shift from knowing to believing was the primary mechanism of our containment. When you know, you are free. When you believe, you are tethered to the one who provides the object of your belief. The transition into the core themes of this exploration will reveal how this containment was achieved and what specific patterns of thought were used to replace the soaring architecture of the original vision. We are stepping out of the nursery of a controlled humanity and into the wild, untamed garden of our true nature. The air is thinner here, the light is brighter, and the responsibility is greater. For once we see the gaps in the tapestry, we can no longer pretend the image is whole. We are called to become the weavers ourselves, integrating the lost threads back into the fabric of our lives, and in doing so, transcending the definition of human that was designed to keep us in our place. To understand the mechanics of how the spirit was bound, we must peer into the core themes that define the transition from a limitless cosmic participant to a tethered terrestrial subject. At the heart of this suppression lies the fundamental concept of separation, the foundational illusion upon which all systems of control are built. In the original, unpruned whispers of the ancient wisdom, the divine was not a distant judge seated upon a throne of clouds, but a pervasive, intelligent luminosity that breathed through the lungs of every living thing. The themes removed from the biblical consciousness were those that emphasized the bridge, the inherent oneness between the Creator and the created. When these bridges were dismantled, a great chasm was opened in the human psyche. This chasm necessitated a mediator, a priesthood, a temple, a specific set of rituals, to span the distance that had been artificially created. By removing the verses that spoke of the soul as a direct spark of the infinite, the architects of the canon successfully externalized God, turning a deep internal resonance into an object of distant worship. This shift is the primary pillar of the human condition as we know it, a state of perpetual seeking for something that we have been told is outside of ourselves. Interwoven with the theme of separation is the concept of the inheritance of scarcity. If the soul is no longer seen as a co-creator or a vessel of the divine, it becomes a beggar in its own house. The core ideas that were likely sanitized from the record were those that described the abundance of the spiritual realm and the human capacity to access that abundance through the alignment of will and consciousness. In their place, a narrative of original flaw and inherent unworthiness was amplified. To keep a population human in the sense of being manageable, one must first convince them that they are broken, that they are born into a debt they can never fully repay. This theological gravity keeps the spirit grounded in a state of apology and supplication. The removed verses likely sang of a different origin, a golden ancestry, where the human spirit emerged from the heart of the cosmos, not as a fallen sinner, but as a daring explorer of the material plane. By replacing the theme of exploration with the theme of exile, the gatekeepers ensured that humanity would focus its energy on earning its way back to a paradise it never truly left, rather than realizing its power to create paradise in the here and now. Another guiding pillar of this cosmic containment is the manipulation of time and destiny. Within the hidden verses, there likely existed a more fluid understanding of the soul's journey, perhaps hinting at the cyclical nature of existence or the pre-existence of the spirit before its descent into the flesh. Such ideas are dangerous to an established order because they grant the individual a perspective that transcends a single lifetime. If you believe you have lived 1,000 lives and will live 1,000 more, the threats of temporary earthly authorities lose their sting. The human narrative was thus narrowed to a linear, one-shot existence, a brief spark of life followed by an eternal judgment. This compression of time creates a profound sense of urgency and fear, making the soul more susceptible to the dictates of those who claim to hold the keys to the afterlife. The core theme here is the monopoly on the future. By removing the verses that suggested a more expansive, sovereign journey for the soul, the institution positioned itself as the sole navigator of the human destiny, turning the infinite sea of time into a narrow, guarded canal. Furthermore, we must consider the theme of the subjugation of the feminine principle of wisdom, often referred to in ancient contexts as Sophia, or the indwelling spirit of understanding. The verses that were removed or obscured frequently dealt with the intuitive, receptive, and mystical aspects of the divine, the mother element of the Godhead that balances the Father. When the feminine was relegated to the sidelines or recast in a strictly subordinate role, the human experience became lopsided, dominated by the masculine principles of law, judgment, and hierarchy. To keep humanity human was to keep it in a state of intellectual and emotional imbalance, where the direct, intuitive knowing of the heart was superseded by the rigid obeying of the mind. This thematic removal effectively lobotomized the spiritual intuition of the masses, leaving them reliant on the literal interpretations of the text provided by the patriarchy. The loss of these verses was the loss of the soul's capacity to see the divine in the soft, the dark, the mysterious, and the nurturing, the very qualities that allow for a truly holistic transformation. Beneath these themes lies a more subtle pattern, the amnesia of power. This is the guiding principle that suggests human beings are observers of reality rather than participants in its creation. The missing verses almost certainly contained instructions on the use of the word, the logos, not just as a historical concept, but as a practical tool for the individual. If the human voice and the human heart, when aligned, can influence the fabric of the material world, then the individual is no longer a subject, but a sovereign. This realization is the ultimate threat to any structure that relies on the human being a predictable cog in a social or religious machine. The themes of the removed verses would have acted as a reminder of our co-creative responsibility. By erasing these reminders, the powers that be fostered a culture of victimhood and passivity, where things happen to people, and their only recourse is to pray to a distant authority to change the outcome. This core theme of passivity is the velvet glove that lines the iron cage of the modern human identity, making the prison feel like a sanctuary of humble faith. Finally, we encounter the theme of the illusion of the veil. The modern biblical narrative often presents a world that is solid, fixed, and largely devoid of the supernatural except for rare, sanctioned miracles. The missing verses, however, likely described a reality that was much more porous, where the boundaries between the physical and the spiritual were thin and easily crossed. To keep a being human is to keep them convinced that the five senses are the only valid arbiters of truth. If the verses taught that we are surrounded by a cloud of witnesses, that we can communicate with the unseen, and that our consciousness can travel beyond the limits of the body, the material world would lose its grip on us. The core theme of sensory entrapment is essential for the maintenance of an earthly kingdom. By removing the descriptions of the higher dimensions of existence, the editors of the Bible ensured that our primary focus remained on the physical, on labor, on reproduction, and on the maintenance of the visible world. We were taught to fear the occult, or the hidden, not because it was evil, but because it was the very realm where our true freedom resides. In summarizing these core themes, we see a deliberate architecture of limitation. Separation, scarcity, linear time, the suppression of the feminine, the amnesia of power, and sensory entrapment work together to form the boundaries of the human experience. Each removed verse was a brick in this wall, and each lost word was a window painted over with the gray paint of dogma. As we prepare to move into the symbolic narratives that illuminate these truths, we must realize that we are not just looking for facts, but for the feelings and the frequencies that these themes were meant to stifle. We are looking for the wild spirit that refuses to be contained by the definitions of men, the spirit that remembers the time before the chasm was dug and the walls were built. The journey continues into the heart of the stories we tell ourselves, for it is in the narrative of the soul that the true battle for our humanity, or our divinity, is fought. To grasp the weight of what was lost, we must move beyond the dry analysis of themes and enter the realm of the mythic, for the soul speaks the language of symbol and story. Imagine, if you will, the parable of the two sunsets. In the version of the world we have been taught, there is only one sun, a distant burning orb that dictates the rhythm of the day and the coming of the night. We are told to watch its rising with gratitude and its setting with a prayer for protection. This is the human sunset, beautiful yet terminal, marking the end of another day of toil. But in the hidden verses, those 45 strands of light that were pulled from the weave, there was a story of a second sun. This sun does not reside in the sky, but in the center of the human chest. It does not set when the world grows dark. In fact, it is only in the deepest darkness that its true brilliance is revealed. The symbolic narrative of the second sun suggests that the external world is a mere reflection of an internal luminosity. When the verses describing this internal star were removed, humanity was left to shiver in the cold of an external winter, constantly seeking warmth from fires they did not light themselves. We became consumers of light rather than generators of it, a symbolic shift that transformed us from radiant beings into shadows seeking a source. Consider also the allegory of the great library and the key of breath. In the ancient esoteric traditions that once whispered through the margins of the early texts, the human body was not described as a temple in the sense of a static stone building, but as a living, breathing library of the entire cosmos. Every cell was a scroll, every drop of blood a verse, and every breath a librarian turning the pages. The removal of the verses was symbolically represented as the theft of the key of breath. In the sanctioned scriptures, breath is merely a biological necessity, a gift from God to keep the clay animated. However, in the deeper, suppressed narratives, breath was the technology of transcendence, a rhythmic bridge that allowed the human to access the divine files stored within their own marrow. By stripping away the specific instructions on how to use the breath to unlock the higher chambers of the mind, the editors effectively locked the library. They told us we could stand in the lobby and admire the architecture, but the knowledge within was forbidden or lost. We are now like heirs to a vast estate who have been told we are only allowed to sleep in the gardener's shed, unaware that the master key is sitting at the bottom of our own lungs. There is another narrative, perhaps the most poignant of all, which concerns the mirror of the deep. In this story, the Creator did not make man in his image as a finished, static sculpture. Rather, he placed a mirror in the heart of the first being. This mirror was meant to reflect the infinite variations of the divine, allowing God to see himself through the eyes of the many. But the mirror was sensitive. It required the silvering of certain truths to remain reflective. The 45 removed verses were the silvering on the back of that mirror. They were the specific truths regarding our sovereignty, our pre-existence, and our power to heal and manifest. When those verses were scratched away by the tools of censorship, the mirror became a simple pane of glass. Instead of seeing the divine when we looked within, we began to see right through ourselves into the empty void of our own perceived insignificance. We stopped seeing the one and started seeing the none. This symbolic loss of the reflective surface is why modern humanity feels so transparent, so easily overlooked by the universe, and so desperate to fill the emptiness with the clutter of the material world. We must also reflect on the story of the weaver and the silence. In this narrative, the word, the logos, was not a singular command barked from the heavens, but a continuous song that the human spirit was meant to harmonize with. Each verse of the original text was a musical note that, when vibrated through the human voice, could rearrange the dust of reality into patterns of beauty and health. The removal of the 45 verses was akin to cutting the strings of a harp. The instrument still looks like a harp, and it can still make a sound when struck, but the full range of its celestial melody is gone. We are left with a truncated scale, a spiritual music that can only play dirges of guilt or simple hymns of obedience. The human, kept by this removal, is a human who has lost their song of power. We have been taught that our words are just air, that our prayers are just hopes, and that our voices have no authority over the elements. The symbolic narrative of the broken harp explains the profound sense of domesticity that is settled over our species. We have been tamed by the loss of our most resonant frequencies. Furthermore, let us consider the tale of the labyrinth of the letter. The suppressed verses often pointed toward the spirit of the law rather than the letter, suggesting that the path to the divine was a straight line through the center of one's own being. To keep us human, the gatekeepers transformed this straight path into a labyrinth of complex laws, genealogies, and historical minutiae. They took the 45 verses that acted as the thread of Ariadne, the guide that leads one out of the maze, and hid them. Without this thread, the seeker becomes lost in the twists and turns of dogma, forever circling the truth but never reaching the center. The labyrinth is designed to be exhausting. It keeps the human occupied with the how of religion, so they never have the energy to experience the why of the spirit. This narrative of the maze illustrates how the removal of simple, direct truths about our divinity forced us into a state of intellectual servitude, where we must rely on map makers, the clergy, to tell us where we are, even though the destination is within our own hearts. Finally, we encounter the symbol of the sleeping giant and the potion of forgetfulness. In the deeper layers of the lost word, humanity was described as a celestial giant that had fallen into a deep sleep, dreaming it was a small, fragile creature of flesh. The 45 verses were the alarm clock, the specific vibrations meant to stir the giant from its slumber. By removing these verses, the architects of our reality administered a spiritual sedative. They convinced the giant that its dreams of flying among the stars were merely fantasies or heresies, and that its true nature was to crawl upon the earth and labor in the fields. The human condition is thus a state of collective narcolepsy. We walk through our lives in a trance, performing the rituals of survival while the giant within us tosses and turns, occasionally catching a glimpse of the lost verses in the fleeting moments between waking and sleep. The symbolic power of this narrative lies in the realization that we do not need to evolve into something more than human. We simply need to wake up from the definition of human that was imposed upon us. As these symbolic narratives merge, they paint a picture of a profound and ancient heist. The theft of the internal sun, the locking of the library of the body, the scratching of the heart mirror, the breaking of the celestial harp, the construction of the theological labyrinth, and the sedation of the cosmic giant. All these are the real-world consequences of the removed verses. We are living in the aftermath of a spiritual blackout. But the beauty of a symbol is that it cannot be truly destroyed. It only waits to be remembered. The stories remind us that the power is not in the paper that was burned, but in the truth that the paper was trying to capture. As we transition into the practical integration of these ideas, we move from the world of myth into the world of action, seeking to find how the modern human can begin to reclaim the fragments of their shattered reflection and sing the song that was supposed to be forgotten. The transition from the ethereal realms of symbol and myth into the lived experience of the modern individual requires a radical reorientation of what it means to exist in the physical world. If we accept that these 45 verses were removed to maintain a specific, manageable definition of humanity, then the act of practical integration becomes an act of quiet, persistent rebellion. It begins with the reclamation of the internal authority that the censorship sought to externalize. In our daily lives, this manifests as a shift from seeking permission to seeking resonance. We have been conditioned to look for a green light from external sources, be they religious institutions, social norms, or the perceived expectations of a distant deity. Integration involves the conscious practice of turning the gaze inward and recognizing that the lost wisdom is actually encoded in our very intuition. When we stop asking, "Is this allowed?" and start asking, "Does this align with the infinite light I carry?" we are effectively reinserting the missing verses into the script of our lives. This is not a call to lawlessness, but a call to a higher law, the law of the Spirit that recognizes the interconnectedness of all things and the inherent dignity of the self as a cosmic participant. The real-world implications of this shift are most visible in how we handle the energy of fear. The human construct was built on the foundation of anxiety, fear of death, fear of judgment, and fear of lack. The removed verses, which spoke of the soul's eternal nature and its co-creative power, were the primary antidotes to this fear. Therefore, to integrate these truths today, one must practice the art of fear alchemy. This involves looking at the systemic structures that profit from our insecurities and choosing to withdraw our emotional currency from them. Practically, this might look like a person deciding that they are no longer broken by their past or limited by their circumstances. By adopting the mindset of the sovereign rather than the subject, the individual begins to change the very chemistry of their body and the trajectory of their day. They begin to see that their thoughts and words are not just internal chatter, but the logos in miniature, capable of shaping their personal reality. This is the practical application of the lost song of power, the realization that our focus is our most potent tool for creation, and where we place our attention is where we are currently writing our own scripture. Furthermore, the integration of these lost concepts demands a new approach to the body and the material world. We have been taught to see the flesh as a burden or a tent that we occupy until we can escape to a higher realm. However, the suppressed wisdom suggests that the body is the very laboratory where the divine and the material merge. Practical integration means treating the physical vessel as a sophisticated instrument of consciousness rather than a mere beast of burden. This involves a more mindful relationship with breath, movement, and the senses. Instead of trying to transcend the human experience, we begin to infuse it with the awareness of our cosmic origins. We start to see that the mundane acts of eating, working, and relating to others are actually sacred rituals that can be performed with the frequency of the second sun. This perspective transforms the human life from a waiting room for heaven into a workshop for the soul. The implications are profound. When the individual no longer sees a division between the sacred and the secular, the entire world becomes their temple, and every interaction becomes an opportunity to reflect the mirror of the deep back to another. In the realm of relationships and community, the removal of the feminine principle and the emphasis on hierarchy created a culture of competition and dominance. To integrate the lost balance, we must actively cultivate the Sophia, or the intuitive wisdom within our social structures. This means valuing empathy, collaboration, and the unseen connections over the rigid, top-down power dynamics that have defined human history. In practice, this looks like building communities that are circular rather than pyramidal, where the authority is shared and the divinity of each member is recognized. It involves a shift from power over to power with. When we reclaim the verses that celebrate the indwelling spirit, we naturally begin to see that same spirit in the other. The social implication is a move away from tribalism and toward a global consciousness. If I am a spark of the infinite, and you are a spark of the infinite, the artificial walls of dogma, race, and nationality that were used to keep us human and divided begin to dissolve. We start to live as a cosmic humanity, a species that understands its unity as a biological and spiritual fact, rather than a distant idealistic goal. There is also a significant cognitive shift required in how we process information and authority. The labyrinth of the letter was designed to make us dependent on interpreters. Practical integration means becoming our own hermeneuticists, interpreters of our own lives. It requires a certain intellectual bravery to question the sanctioned narratives and to look for the hidden truths in all areas of life, not just religion. This might involve exploring the edges of science, the depths of psychology, or the heights of artistic expression to find the fragments of the lost tapestry. It is the practice of holistic discernment, where we no longer take truth at face value because it comes from a pulpit or a textbook, but because it rings true in the hollows of our own bones. This real-world application creates an immune system for the mind, protecting the individual from the manipulations of those who wish to keep them small. By reclaiming the key of breath and the library of the body, the modern seeker becomes an unshakable node of truth in a world of static, a person who cannot be easily swayed by the winds of manufactured fear. Ultimately, the integration of these concepts leads to the end of exile. We stop living as if we are refugees on this planet and start living as its rightful stewards and inhabitants. The human, who has been kept in place by the removal of 45 verses, is a human who is always looking for an exit strategy. The human, who has reclaimed those verses, is one who is fully present, fully grounded, and fully alive. The practical implication is a life lived with a sense of purpose that is not dictated by an external script, but authored by an internal fire. We begin to move through the world with the grace of the sleeping giant who has finally opened its eyes. We realize that the world does not need more human beings as they have been traditionally defined. It needs more beings who have transcended that definition and are ready to anchor the frequencies of the stars into the soil of the earth. As we move toward the conclusion of this journey, we must ask ourselves if we are ready to step out of the comfort of the narrow cage and into the terrifying, beautiful vastness of our true, unedited selves. As we reach the summit of this long climb through the hidden valleys of the lost word, we must recognize that the story of the 45 removed verses is not a tragedy of the past, but a transformational map for the future. We have journeyed from the initial recognition of the missing strands in our spiritual tapestry, through the architectural themes of limitation that have defined the modern human experience, and into the deep, symbolic narratives that remind us of our internal sun and our broken harps. We have seen how the practical integration of these truths acts as a solvent for the glue of fear and a bridge across the chasm of separation. Now, we stand at the threshold of the most vital realization of all, that the removal was never truly final. No hand of man, no matter how powerful or persistent, can ever truly erase the signature of the divine from the heart of the creation. The verses may have been struck from the physical page, but they were never struck from the spirit. They remain as a latent frequency, a dormant genetic code, waiting for the moment of our recognition to flare back into life. The conclusion of this exploration is not a mourning for what was lost, but a celebration of what is currently being found within the depths of our own awakening. The transformational call of this journey is an invitation to move beyond the identity of the sanitized human, the version of ourselves that is defined by our flaws, our obedience, and our limitations. To answer this call is to reclaim the title of the cosmic human, a being who understands that the boundaries between the physical and the spiritual are as thin as a summer mist. This shift requires a profound act of self-remembrance. We must look at the structures of our world, the cathedrals of stone and the cathedrals of the mind, and realize that they are not the source of our light, but merely the frames we have placed around it. The true Holy of Holies is not a room hidden behind a veil in an ancient temple. It is the silent center of your own consciousness, where the missing 45 verses are still being sung in a language that predates the creation of the world. To hear them, we must learn to quiet the static of the human condition and tune our internal receiver to the frequency of the infinite. This is the ultimate rebellion, to be whole in a world that profits from our perceived brokenness. As we bridge the insights of this narrative, we see that the removal of these verses was part of a larger cosmic drama, a period of deep densification where humanity was meant to experience the illusion of isolation to its fullest extent. In this sense, the censorship served a purpose, acting as a cocoon that protected the emerging soul until it was strong enough to break free. But the season of the cocoon is ending. The pressure we feel in the modern age, the sense of a world in crisis and a spirit in longing, is the pressure of the butterfly pushing against the walls of its limitation. The lost verses are the wings that have been growing in the dark. By reclaiming our sovereignty, by acknowledging our co-creative power, and by re-establishing our direct connection to the source, we are essentially completing the Bible of our own lives. We are taking the pen back from the editors of history and writing the final chapters ourselves. This is the transformational call, to stop being characters in a story written by others and to become the authors of a reality that reflects our true celestial stature. Consider the profound responsibility that comes with this awakening. If you are not a fallen creature waiting for a distant rescue, but a sovereign being with the logos vibrating in your throat, then your every thought, word, and action becomes a brushstroke on the canvas of existence. The world is no longer a place of exile, but a garden of manifestation. We are called to live with a terrifying and beautiful level of intentionality. This means treating our fellow beings not as fellow prisoners in the human cage, but as fellow gods who have also forgotten their names. The social and planetary implications of this are staggering. A humanity that remembers its divinity cannot be ruled by fear. It cannot be driven to destroy its own home, and it cannot be convinced that the suffering of the other is irrelevant. The reintegration of the lost word is the catalyst for a global metamorphosis, a shift from a culture of survival to a culture of radiance. We are the ones we have been waiting for, and the second coming is not an external event, but the internal arrival of our own higher awareness. In the stillness of this conclusion, I invite you to feel the weight of the mirror of the deep within your own heart. Feel the second sun warming your chest, even as the external world grows cold and uncertain. The 45 verses were removed to keep you human, but the very fact that you are seeking them proves that the plan has failed. You are more than the labels, the laws, and the limitations that have been placed upon you. You are a living verse of the original song, a strand of the gold thread that refuses to be plucked from the weave. The journey ahead is not one of finding something new, but of uncovering what has always been there. It is a walk through the ruins of the old dogma, picking up the shimmering fragments of the truth and fitting them back into the mosaic of your life. As you walk, you will find that the path becomes clearer, the air becomes thinner, and the music of the spheres becomes louder. You are returning to yourself, and in that return, you are healing the wound of the world. Let this final message be the alarm clock for the sleeping giant within you. The trance of the human condition is breaking. The walls of the labyrinth are turning to smoke. The potion of forgetfulness is losing its power, and the key of breath is already in your hand. As you step forward from this exploration, do so with the grace of one who knows they are eternal, the courage of one who knows they are sovereign, and the love of one who knows they are one with all that is. The Bible of the Spirit is being reopened, and your life is the most beautiful passage yet to be read. Go forth not as a servant of the Word, but as the Word itself made flesh, radiant and uncontained, forever unfolding in the infinite light of the true, unedited divine. The shadows of the past have no power over the light of the present, and you are that light, shining now and always in the heart of the cosmic morning. To be human was only ever a beginning. To be divine is your destiny. Now the story is yours to finish.